Commander Sarah Chun had heard it 1,000 times across a dozen star systems. Humans are so fragile. How did such delicate creatures ever leave their homeworld? The Galactic Council's medical database listed humans as having brittle bones, weak immune systems, and laughably short lifespans. Every alien species she'd encountered seemed amazed that humanity had survived long enough to develop spaceflight. But as Sarah sat in her damaged ship, surrounded by the wreckage of what was once the most feared pirate fleet in the Outer Rim, she couldn't help but smile. The medical scanner in her hand beeped softly, displaying the results of her latest injury assessment. 3 broken ribs, a concussion, internal bleeding, and enough radiation exposure to kill most species twice over. She flipped to page 3 of the Standard Galactic Emergency Medical Protocol Handbook, the page every alien medic knew by heart, the page that listed the maximum survivable trauma thresholds for known species. Her finger traced down to the human entry, and her smile widened. What the galaxy didn't understand was that being fragile and being breakable were 2 very different things. They were about to learn the difference the hard way. The first time Dr. Zephyr Calvin saw a human, he was convinced someone was playing an elaborate joke. The creature standing before him in the medical bay of Nexus Station was impossibly small, barely reaching his chest plates, with pale pink skin that looked like it would tear at the slightest touch. Its bones appeared to be made of something weaker than crystalline calcium, and its single heart pumped red fluid through visible veins beneath translucent skin. "This is Commander Sarah Chun of the UEF Resilience," announced the station's AI with typical mechanical precision. "She requires medical clearance for deep space patrol duty." Dr. Calthan's 4 eyes blinked in sequence, a sign of bewilderment among his people. As the head of xenobiology at one of the galaxy's premier medical facilities, he had examined over 300 different species. The Crowthans with their tungsten-reinforced skeletons. The void swimmers who could survive in hard vacuum for hours. The crystalline ethereals who were essentially living rock formations. But humans? They defied every logical principle of spacefaring evolution. "Remove your clothing for examination," he instructed, his translator rendering his clicking speech into the human's primitive auditory language. Sarah complied without hesitation, revealing more of the same fragile construction. Her muscle density was laughably low compared to any other species rated for space combat. Her bone structure seemed designed more for a low-gravity garden world than the harsh realities of interstellar conflict. "Your species file indicates you have only 1 heart," Dr. Calvin observed, running his scanner over her chest. "How do you maintain circulation during high-stress situations?" "We make do," Sarah replied simply, her voice carrying an undertone that the doctor's species couldn't quite interpret. Among humans, it would have been recognized as dry humor mixed with something far more dangerous. The examination continued for 2 hours. Every test confirmed what the Galactic Medical Database had already established. Humans were absurdly fragile. Their bones contained only a fraction of the mineral density found in other spacefaring species. Their immune systems were so weak they required constant medication just to survive in standard galactic environments. Their cellular repair mechanisms were primitive at best, and their lifespan was measured in mere decades rather than centuries. "I must recommend against approving this creature for deep space duty," Dr. Calvin told his assistant, a young Thraxian intern whose chitinous exterior could probably withstand a direct plasma bolt. "The survival parameters are simply too low." But the assistant was staring at something on her data pad, her mandibles clicking in confusion. "Doctor, I'm reading the human's previous mission reports. She's completed 17 combat tours in the Outer Rim. Her ship has been destroyed 3 times, and she's been declared dead twice by our own medical protocols." Dr. Calvin snatched the pad from her claws. The reports were indeed there, filed in the central database, and verified by multiple sources. Sarah Chun had single-handedly disabled a Marauder dreadnought after her ship's weapons failed. She had survived a direct hit from a quantum torpedo that should have vaporized her entire vessel. Most incredibly, She had once continued fighting for 6 hours with injuries that the database classified as invariably fatal to all known species. There must be some error, the doctor muttered, his translator struggling with his rapidly clicking speech. These readings are impossible. Sarah finished dressing and turned to face him. The movement was fluid, showing no signs of the weakness her physiology suggested. Doctor, may I see my medical file? Cal then handed over the pad reluctantly. Sarah's eyes scanned the data quickly, and then she did something that would haunt the doctor's dreams for cycles to come. She laughed. It wasn't the bitter laugh of a creature acknowledging its own limitations, or the hollow laugh of madness that he had heard from other species pushed beyond their breaking points. It was genuine amusement, as if she found the entire situation delightfully entertaining. "This is interesting," she said, scrolling through the data. "According to this, I should have died from radiation poisoning during the Sigma Draconis incident, and again from blood loss during the battle at Kepler Station. Oh, and apparently I'm currently dying from cellular damage that accumulated during my last patrol." She looked up at the doctor with bright, alert eyes that showed no sign of impending death. "Doctor, has your species ever encountered the concept of redundancy?" "Redundancy," he repeated, the word carrying different connotations in his language. "Backup systems. Multiple ways to accomplish the same task. See, your scanner is very good at telling you what our bodies are made of, but it doesn't understand how we use what we have." Sarah tapped the pad screen. "You're measuring our bones against species that evolved on high-gravity worlds. You're comparing our immune systems to creatures that developed in sterile environments. You're judging our lifespans against beings who measure existence in geological time." She paused, and her expression shifted to something that made Dr. Colthan's primary heart skip a beat. It was the look of a predator explaining why the prey had already lost. "But here's what your scanner can't measure: adaptability. You see fragile bones, but you don't see how quickly they heal or how they become stronger after each break. You see a weak immune system, but you miss how it learns and remembers every threat it encounters. You see a short lifespan, but you don't understand the intensity with which we live every moment of it." The doctor's assistant had stopped pretending to work and was listening with rapt attention. This was the first time either of them had heard a human speak at length about their species' capabilities. "We're not built to be unbreakable," Sarah continued. "We're built to break and keep going anyway. Your people have redundant organs and reinforced skeletons because you evolved to avoid damage. We evolved to take damage and turn it into experience." She handed the pad back to the doctor. "Every scar is a lesson learned. Every injury survived makes us harder to kill the next time. Every setback teaches us a new way to win." Dr. Cal then stared at the medical readings that had seemed so conclusive moments before. Now, they looked incomplete, like someone had given him half the data and expected him to understand the whole picture. "There's something else," Sarah added, almost as an afterthought. "Your database lists our maximum survivable trauma thresholds based on ideal conditions. Clean injuries, immediate medical attention, perfect treatment protocols. But the thing about humans is that we don't usually encounter ideal conditions." She moved toward the door, then paused. "Doctor, what does page 3 of your emergency medical handbook say about human trauma survival rates?" Colthan's claws fumbled with his reference guide, flipping to the page in question. His eyes widened as he read the entry he had memorized during his training. "Human subjects may survive trauma levels up to 300% of listed thresholds under emergency conditions. Mechanism unknown." "Mechanism unknown," Sarah repeated. "That's the phrase that should terrify every enemy of humanity, Doctor. Because if your best scientists can't explain how we do what we do, how can our enemies predict what we're capable of?" She stepped toward the door, then turned back one final time. "Oh, and Doctor, those 17 combat tours I mentioned, I'm the one they send when everyone else has given up. When a situation is hopeless and the odds are impossible, they call for the fragile little human to sort things out." The door closed behind her with a soft hiss, leaving Dr. Calvin and his assistant staring at readings that suddenly seemed less like medical data and more like a warning label on a weapon they didn't understand. The assistant was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. "Doctor, if humans are this resilient, why do they let everyone think they're fragile?" Cal then thought about the question for a long moment, replaying the conversation in his mind. Sarah Chun had never once claimed her species was tough or resilient. She had simply explained why their perceived weakness was actually their greatest strength. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "because being underestimated is the most powerful advantage a species can have." The next day, Sarah's medical clearance came through without question. Dr. Cal then had approved her for unlimited deep space duty, with a note in his report that would later be quoted in military academies across the galaxy. Subject exhibits survival capabilities far exceeding database parameters. Recommend immediate upgrade of human threat assessment protocols. But the real change had already begun in the doctor's mind. As he watched Sarah's ship disappear into the star field, he realized that everything the Galactic Council thought it knew about humanity might be dangerously wrong. The humans weren't just fragile survivors who had somehow stumbled into space. They were something far more dangerous, a species that had turned their weaknesses into weapons and their limitations into advantages. And they were just getting started. 3 months after her medical examination, Sarah Chun found herself exactly where Command had expected, in the middle of an impossible situation with odds that would make any sensible being surrender immediately. The UEF Resilience hung dead in space, its main reactor offline and life support failing. Around her, the twisted wreckage of the Bloodfang Raiders floated like metallic confetti against the star field. What had started as a routine patrol had escalated into the largest pirate engagement in Outer Rim history when Sarah had stumbled across their secret base. She should have called for backup, should have retreated and reported the discovery to Fleet Command, should have done any number of things that would have kept her alive and followed proper protocol. Instead, she had done what humans do when faced with unacceptable odds. She had attacked. The battle had lasted 14 hours. 14 hours of continuous combat against 47 enemy vessels, including 3 heavy cruisers that outmassed her ship by factors of 10. Her weapons had failed after hour 6. Her shields had collapsed during hour 9. By hour 12, she was fighting with manual systems and emergency power. But humans had learned long ago that winning wasn't always about having the best equipment or overwhelming firepower. Sometimes winning was about being willing to break things that everyone else considered unbreakable, including yourself. Sarah pulled herself through the damaged corridors of her ship, her body screaming protests that she had learned to ignore years ago. The gravity generators had failed, but her inner ear had adapted to zero-G operations with the fluid grace that came from a childhood spent in the asteroid mining colonies of Sol System. Each movement sent spikes of pain through her broken ribs, but pain was just information, and right now it was telling her she was still alive. The bridge was a disaster zone of sparking consoles and shattered displays. Lieutenant Torres hung unconscious in his restraints, an ugly gash across his forehead, seeping blood that formed perfect spheres in the zero gravity. Ensign Park was conscious but pale, her left arm bent at an angle that suggested multiple fractures. "Report," Sarah said as she pulled herself into the command chair, her voice steady despite the fact that her internal organs felt like they had been rearranged by an angry giant. "Main reactor is gone," Park said through gritted teeth. "Quantum core breach contained, but we're running on backup cells. Maybe 6 hours of life support left." She paused, checking her instruments with her good arm. "Communications array is destroyed. Long-range sensors are offline. And, Commander," her voice caught, "we're drifting into the gravity well of that dead star." Sarah called up the navigation display on her wrist unit, one of the few systems still functioning. The data confirmed Park's assessment. The Resilience was caught in the gravitational pull of a neutron star, dragging them inexorably toward a death that would compress their atoms into exotic matter. Any other species would have begun composing their final messages to loved ones. The ship was crippled, communications were down, and they were falling toward an inescapable gravity well. By every logical assessment, they were dead. But Sarah Chun had stopped believing in logical assessments the day she had watched her parents' mining ship explode in the asteroid belt. She had been 12 years old, floating in a damaged escape pod with 6 hours of air, watching rescue ships search in the wrong direction. Logic had said she would die. Logic had been wrong. "Park, I need you to get to engineering," she said, already pulling up schematics on her display. "Check the quantum resonance chamber. If we're lucky, the containment breach left us with some exotic matter residue." "Commander, even if there is residue, we can't restart the main reactor without—" "I'm not planning to restart the reactor," Sarah interrupted. "I'm planning to turn our ship into a bomb." The silence that followed was broken only by the steady beep of failing systems and Torres' labored breathing. Park stared at her commander with an expression caught between admiration and terror. "A bomb, Mom." Sarah began pulling up technical specifications, her fingers dancing across the interface despite the pain shooting through her injured torso. "The Bloodfang base is still out there, heavily shielded, built into an asteroid, probably housing enough pirates to raid this entire sector for the next decade." She highlighted several key systems on the display. "But their shields are designed to keep people out, not to keep explosions in." "Commander, we don't have any weapons left. Our missile tubes are empty. The plasma cannons are slag, and we don't need weapons," Sarah said with the kind of calm that made experienced soldiers nervous. "We have something better. We have physics." She explained her plan with the methodical precision of someone who had spent years thinking about impossible problems. The neutron star's gravity, well, wasn't just pulling them toward death. It was accelerating them to a significant fraction of light speed. At those velocities, even a small object became a kinetic weapon of devastating power. "The exotic matter residue from our reactor breach is still contained in emergency storage pods," she continued. "If we can rig a delayed detonation and use the gravitational slingshot effect to accelerate past the neutron star, we could put the resilience on a collision course with the pirate base at roughly 15% of light speed." Park's eyes widened as she understood the implications. The kinetic energy release would be equivalent to a stellar-class fusion bomb. "Exactly. The pirates' shields won't even register our approach until it's too late. They'll think we're just another piece of debris from the battle." "But, Commander," Park said quietly, "that plan requires someone to stay behind and manually trigger the detonation. The automated systems are too damaged to handle the timing calculations." Sarah smiled, and Park finally understood why the other species found humans so unsettling. It wasn't the smile of someone contemplating death. It was the smile of someone who had found an elegant solution to an impossible problem. "I've been manually calculating orbital mechanics since I was old enough to hold a slide rule," Sarah said. "Consider it a family tradition." Over the next 4 hours, Sarah and Park worked with the desperate efficiency of people who knew they were racing against both time and physics. Torres regained consciousness halfway through their preparations, and after Sarah explained the plan, simply nodded and began helping with his good arm. The modifications to the ship's systems required bypassing safety protocols that existed for very good reasons. They cannibalized emergency equipment, rerouted power from life support, and turned their vessel into something that would have horrified any engineer who designed her. "Escape pods are prepped and loaded," Torres reported, his voice slurred from the head injury, but his hands steady on the controls. "Course plotted for the automated distress beacon. Fleet should pick you up in 36 hours. "Good," Sarah said. Not looking up from the detonation sequence she was programming into the ship's computer. "Make sure you transmit everything we learned about the pirate base. Fleet needs to know what we're dealing with out here." Park cleared her throat. "Commander, the pods have room for 3. The automated systems can handle the slingshot maneuver. You don't have to stay behind." Sarah looked up from her work, meeting the younger woman's eyes. "Yes, I do. The timing on this detonation has to be perfect, down to the microsecond. One mistake, and we either miss the target completely or detonate too close to the neutron star." She paused, her expression softening slightly. Besides, someone needs to make sure the galaxy knows what happened here. That humans don't just give up when the odds are impossible. Ma'am, that's an order in sign. The escape pods launched 20 minutes later, their occupants watching through the rear viewers as the Resilience continued its deadly dance with the neutron star's gravity well. Sarah remained alone on the bridge, surrounded by the ghosts of her crew and the steady countdown of systems failing one by one. She thought about Dr. Colthan's examination, about the way he had looked at her like she was some kind of biological impossibility. If he could see her now, broken and bleeding and riding a crippled ship toward almost certain death, would he still think humans were fragile? The answer, she knew, was that fragility had nothing to do with it. Every species in the galaxy was fragile when you reduced them to their component parts. The difference was what you did when those parts started failing. The Kralthan would have calculated the odds and surrendered when the math didn't add up. The Ethereals would have accepted death with philosophical resignation. The Void Swimmers would have tried to outlast the problem through sheer endurance. But humans? Humans looked at impossible situations and asked, what if we break the rules? The proximity alarms began sounding as the Resilience reached the critical point of her trajectory. Through the bridge viewports, Sarah could see the pirate base growing larger, its defensive systems finally registering her approach. Plasma bolts reached out toward her ship, but at her current velocity, they might as well have been throwing stones at a comet. Sarah's finger hovered over the detonation trigger, waiting for the perfect moment. The calculations scrolled through her mind with mechanical precision, accounting for gravitational effects, relativistic time dilation, and the structural integrity of her target. In her final seconds, she thought about the message this would send to the galaxy. Not that humans were unbreakable, but that they were willing to break themselves if that's what it took to get the job done. The pirate base filled her viewport, its shields glowing with desperate energy as they tried to deflect a kinetic impact that would have cracked the moon. Sarah smiled and pressed the trigger. Admiral Thexkar had seen a lot of impossible things during his 8 centuries of service in the Galactic Navy, but nothing had prepared him for the report that landed on his desk 3 days after the Bloodfang incident. The pirate base was gone. Not just destroyed, but completely vaporized along with a significant portion of the asteroid it had been built into. The energy release had been visible from systems away, a brief star that had burned brighter than the local sun for exactly 3.7 seconds. That part wasn't impossible. Stellar-class fusion weapons existed, though they were rare and heavily regulated. What was impossible was sitting in his office, calmly sipping synthetic coffee, and explaining how she had survived ground zero of an explosion that should have scattered her atoms across several light minutes of space. You're telling me, Admiral Thexkar said, his translator struggling with the clicking sounds of his native language, that you manually piloted your ship away from the detonation at the last possible second? Commander Sarah Chin nodded, as if she were discussing the weather. The escape pod's thrusters were still functional, but they needed someone to calculate the burn timing manually. The computer systems were too damaged to account for the gravitational anomalies around the neutron star. The Admiral's 4 eyes focused on the medical report in front of him. Sarah had been found floating in her escape pod 67 hours after the explosion, technically dead by the standards of most species. Her heart had stopped, her brain activity had ceased, and her body temperature had dropped to levels that would cause irreversible cellular damage in any known life form. Yet here she was very much alive and apparently unaware that she had done something that violated several fundamental principles of biology. The medical team that recovered you, the Admiral continued, classified you as deceased. They were preparing your body for military honors when you suddenly resumed breathing and asked for a status report. Sarah shrugged, a gesture that sent small spikes of pain through her still healing ribs. The pod's life support had failed, so my body shut down to conserve oxygen. It's a survival mechanism. Humans from the outer colonies learned to do it as children. Admiral Thexkar had commanded fleets across a dozen star systems. He had seen the Kralthan death soldiers who could fight for days without rest, the crystalline ethereals who could survive in the vacuum of space, and the legendary void swimmers who could hibernate for centuries. But none of them could voluntarily die and return to life as if it were a minor inconvenience. Survival mechanism, he repeated slowly. Commander, according to our xenobiological experts, no known species possesses the ability to suspend all vital functions and then resume them at will. Well, Sarah said with that unsettling human smile, I guess that makes the xenobiological experts wrong, doesn't it? The Admiral set down the report and leaned back in his chair, studying the small human sitting across from his desk. Sarah Chin looked like she could be knocked over by a strong breeze, but she had just single-handedly eliminated the most dangerous pirate organization in the Outer Rim and somehow survived her own suicide mission. There's something else, he said, pulling up another file. Intelligence reports indicate that there were survivors from the pirate base. They were found drifting in escape pods, babbling about how humans are demons that refuse to die. One of them keeps insisting that you appeared on their screens after the explosion, laughing as their base was destroyed. Sarah's expression didn't change. Pirates say a lot of things when they're scared. So you didn't transmit a message to them before the detonation? For the first time during the interview, Sarah's composure cracked slightly. A small smile played at the corners of her mouth. I might have mentioned that they had picked the wrong species to underestimate. The Admiral pulled up the transmission log that intelligence had recovered from the pirate base's wreckage. The final message received by their communications array was brief but memorable. This is Commander Sarah Chun of the UEF Resilience. You want to know how fragile humans really are? Page 3, Section 12 of your medical database. We don't just survive the unsurvivable. We come back from the dead to finish the job. Commander, the Admiral said carefully, you do realize that this incident is going to fundamentally change how the galaxy views humanity? Sarah nodded. Good. It's about time. The implications are staggering. If humans can survive trauma that kills other species, if you can literally return from clinical death, if you can turn hopeless situations into decisive victories. He trailed off, overwhelmed by the possibilities. Admiral, with respect, you're overthinking this. Sarah stood up, moving with the fluid grace that belied her recent injuries. We're not invincible. We're not superhuman. We're just very, very hard to kill, and we have a cultural aversion to giving up. She walked to the viewport that dominated one wall of the Admiral's office, looking out at the star field where her ship had once floated as a burning wreck. Every human child grows up hearing stories about people who faced impossible odds and found a way through. We don't have the luxury of superior technology or enhanced biology, so we learn to excel at the one thing we could control, refusing to accept defeat. The Admiral joined her at the viewport, his massive frame dwarfing her small human form. But surely there are limits to what you can endure. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of personal experience. When I was 12, I watched my parents' ship explode during a mining accident. I spent 6 hours in a damaged escape pod, convinced I was going to die. The rescue ships were searching in the wrong sector, and I had enough air for maybe 4 hours if I was lucky. She pressed her hand against the transparent aluminum of the viewport, leaving small fingerprints on the surface. So I did what humans do when we're faced with the impossible. I found a way to make 4 hours last 6. I slowed my breathing, lower my heart rate, and use an emergency beacon to signal the exact coordinates where my parents' ship had been destroyed. The rescue team found me unconscious and barely breathing but alive. The official report listed it as miraculous survival. But it wasn't a miracle, Admiral. It was just a human being who refused to die when dying would have been convenient for the universe. The Admiral felt something he hadn't experienced in centuries of military service, a chill that had nothing to do with the environmental controls. This small, fragile-looking human was describing feats of survival that bordered on supernatural, and she spoke about them as if they were perfectly normal. The thing about humans, Sarah continued, is that we've never had the option of being anything other than stubborn. Our homeworld tried to kill us with ice ages, plagues, natural disasters, and predators that were faster, stronger, and better armed than we were. We survived because we were too stupid to know when we were beaten. She turned away from the viewport, meeting the Admiral's compound eyes with her own unnaturally bright human gaze. That's what the galaxy doesn't understand about us. We're not tough because we're built to be tough. We're tough because we've had millions of years of practice at being too stubborn to die. The intercom on the Admiral's desk chimed with an incoming priority message. The voice that emerged belonged to Dr. Calvin, the xenobiologist who had examined Sarah months earlier. "Admiral, I've completed my analysis of Commander Chen's medical data from the incident. Sir, I need to speak with you immediately. What I've found, it changes everything we thought we knew about human physiology." Admiral Thexkar looked at Sarah, who was already moving toward the door. "Doctor, the commander is here now. Please transmit your findings to my office." The holographic display activated, showing a three-dimensional representation of human anatomy alongside comparative data from dozens of other species. Dr. Calthin's image appeared in the corner, his four eyes wide with something between fascination and terror. Commander Chen's survival of the Bloodfang incident represents a paradigm shift in our understanding of human capabilities, the doctor began, highlighting various systems within the anatomical model. Her body's response to lethal trauma follows patterns we've never observed in any other species. The display zoomed in on the human circulatory system. When faced with fatal injury, most species experience cascading organ failure. But humans appear to have evolved redundant pathways that allow them to maintain minimal function even under extreme duress. "We already knew that," the Admiral interjected. "Yes, but this goes far beyond anything we previously documented." New data scrolled across the screen, showing cellular activity patterns that defied conventional biology. Commander Chen's body doesn't just tolerate damage, it actively adapts to it. Each injury triggers genetic responses that make her more resistant to similar trauma in the future. Sarah watched the display with professional interest, as if she were reviewing someone else's medical file. "Doctor, are you saying that humans evolve in real time?" "Not exactly evolution, but something functionally similar. Your bodies treat each survival experience as a lesson, encoding the information at the cellular level. Every human who survives extreme trauma becomes slightly more capable of surviving the next extreme situation." The implications hit Admiral Thexkar like a physical blow. "You're describing a species that becomes more dangerous every time you try to kill them." Dr. Calvin nodded grimly. "Precisely. And given humanity's history of conflict and survival, you're dealing with a population that has been inadvertently training for galactic warfare for millennia." Sarah smiled, and for the first time, the Admiral understood why the pirates had called humans demons. It wasn't cruelty or malice in that expression. It was the quiet confidence of a predator that had just realized its prey had been underestimating it for a very long time. "Gentlemen," she said softly, "I think it's time the galaxy learned what humans are really capable of when we stop pretending to be fragile." 6 months after the Bloodfang incident, the Galactic Council convened an emergency session that would be remembered as the day the universe learned to fear the fragile little humans from Sol System. The council chambers on Nexus Prime housed representatives from 847 different species, their diverse forms arrayed in carefully climate-controlled sections that accommodated everything from methane-breathing crystalline beings to energy-based life forms that existed as pure thought. At the center of the massive amphitheater, a single human stood before the assembled delegates. Commander Sarah Chun had been promoted to Fleet Admiral in the weeks following her impossible survival, but she wore her new rank lightly. To the alien delegates, she still looked exactly like what their databases had always said humans were: small, fragile, and utterly unsuited for the harsh realities of galactic civilization. "Admiral Chun," spoke Counselor Voltar of the Hegemony, his mechanical voice echoing through the chamber's acoustic amplifiers. "You stand before this assembly accused of genocide, war crimes, and the deliberate violation of 17 different interspecies treaties. Sarah remained perfectly still, her hands clasped behind her back in a posture the human military personnel would recognize as parade rest. To the alien observers, it looked like a creature preparing for execution with dignity. The charges, Veltar continued, stem from your species' recent military actions in the Outer Rim territories. Human forces have systematically destroyed 12 pirate strongholds, liberated 43 slave colonies, and eliminated what our intelligence services estimate to be over 50,000 criminal combatants. A murmur ran through the assembled delegates. The numbers were staggering, representing military action on a scale that most species would require years of preparation to accomplish. Humanity had done it in 6 months, with minimal losses. The concerning factor, added Counselor THYSS of the Ethereal Collective, her crystalline voice ringing like chimes, is not the scope of your operations, but the methods employed. Our observers report that human forces routinely engage in combat scenarios with survival rates that should be mathematically impossible. Sarah finally spoke, her voice clear and steady in the vast chamber. Counselors, I'm not sure I understand the nature of these charges. My species was invited to join the Galactic Council specifically because of our military capabilities. We were asked to help address the piracy problem that has plagued the Outer Rim for decades. Yes, Veltar replied, but we expected you to follow established military protocols. Acceptable loss ratios, strategic withdrawal when faced with superior force, adherence to the recognized rules of engagement. Instead, human forces appear to operate under the assumption that no situation is hopeless enough to require surrender. From her position at the center of the chamber, Sarah could see hundreds of alien faces turned toward her. Some showed curiosity, others fear, and a few displayed what she had learned to recognize as the galactic equivalent of respect. But most showed confusion, as if they were trying to understand a puzzle that violated their fundamental assumptions about reality. Counselors, she said, perhaps the confusion stems from different definitions of what constitutes an acceptable outcome. When human forces engage pirate strongholds, we don't calculate acceptable loss ratios because we don't consider losing to be acceptable. Counselor Zephyran of the Void Swimmers leaned forward in his specialized tank, his bioluminescent patches pulsing with what Sarah had learned was agitation. Admiral, your species' casualty reports are statistically anomalous. In the Battle of Kepler's Edge, human forces engaged a pirate fleet 3 times their size and suffered 0 fatalities while completely destroying the enemy force. That's correct, Sarah confirmed. It's impossible, Zephyran stated flatly. No species in galactic history has achieved such combat efficiency without employing weapons of mass destruction or overwhelming technological superiority. Human equipment is adequate, but not exceptional. Your ships are well designed, but not revolutionary. By all logical analysis, you should have been destroyed. Sarah smiled, and several delegates shifted uncomfortably in their environmental suits. They had learned to be wary of human smiles. Counselor, I think you're making the same mistake that Dr. Calvin made when he first examined me. You're measuring our capabilities against your own limitations instead of trying to understand what makes us different. She activated her personal data pad, and holographic displays materialized throughout the chamber, showing tactical analyses of recent human military operations. The assembled delegates studied the information with the focused attention of beings trying to understand a fundamental shift in galactic power dynamics. At Kepler's Edge, human forces didn't win because we had better weapons or superior technology. We won because when faced with a larger enemy force, we didn't ask ourselves, how can we survive this encounter? We asked ourselves, how can we use this situation to eliminate the piracy problem permanently? The tactical displays shifted to show the battle from multiple perspectives. Human ships moving in patterns that defied conventional military doctrine, taking damage that should have been crippling while maintaining combat effectiveness that grew stronger as the fight continued. Your strategic analyses assume that combat efficiency decreases as forces take damage, Sarah continued. But human military doctrine is based on the opposite assumption. We fight better when we're hurt because injury focuses our attention and eliminates distractions. Counselor Teachwisses spoke again, her crystalline voice carrying harmonics of uncertainty. Admiral, are you claiming that humans deliberately seek out combat situations where you will be injured? Not deliberately, no, but we don't avoid them either. Every human military officer is trained to function effectively while wounded, exhausted, and operating with damaged equipment. We call it fighting hurt, and it's considered a basic survival skill. The chamber fell silent as delegates processed this information. Several species had military traditions that emphasized courage and sacrifice, but none had ever encountered a species that treated severe injury as a temporary inconvenience. There's something else, Sarah said, advancing to the next set of tactical displays. Your intelligence reports focus on human survival rates, but they miss the strategic implications of our operational philosophy. New data filled the holographic displays, showing the long-term effects of human military interventions. Pirate activity in sectors where humans had operated had dropped to nearly zero, not just because the pirates were dead, but because word had spread throughout the criminal underworld that humans were something entirely different from previous peacekeeping forces. When pirates attack a Crowthan patrol, they expect casualties, but eventual victory if they bring enough ships. When they attack ethereal forces, they know they'll face superior technology, but predictable tactics. When they attack void swimmers, they plan for extended engagements with acceptable losses on both sides. Sarah paused, letting the implications settle. But when pirates encounter humans, they don't make strategic calculations anymore. They run, not because we're invincible, but because we've demonstrated that we don't follow the rules that govern how galactic conflicts are supposed to work. Counselor Veltar accessed his own data files, cross-referencing human combat reports with historical precedents. Admiral, you're describing asymmetric warfare on a scale that borders on psychological manipulation. I'm describing humans being human, Sarah replied. We're not trying to manipulate anyone. We're simply approaching problems from a perspective that other species find difficult to understand. She gestured to the assembled delegates, representing hundreds of worlds and billions of beings. Every species in this chamber evolved strategies for dealing with threats. The Crowthans developed overwhelming physical strength. The Ethereals created superior technology. The Void Swimmers mastered endurance and patience. All valid approaches, all logical responses to environmental challenges. The displays shifted again, showing comparative evolutionary data that painted a picture of humanity's unique development path. But humans evolved on a world that tried to kill us with everything it had. Ice ages, volcanic eruptions, asteroid impacts, predators, diseases, natural disasters that would have wiped out most species entirely. We didn't develop superior strength or technology or endurance. We developed the ability to refuse to die when dying would have been convenient. Counselor Zephran's bioluminescent patches pulsed in rapid sequence, indicating deep thought. Admiral, are you suggesting that human military effectiveness stems from an evolutionary aversion to accepting defeat? I'm suggesting that humans have spent millions of years learning that there's always another option, even when all the obvious options have been exhausted. Especially when all the obvious options have been exhausted. Sarah deactivated the holographic displays and stood alone in the center of the vast chamber, surrounded by beings who represented the collected wisdom and power of galactic civilization. Counselors, you asked me to address charges of genocide and war crimes. But the pirates we've eliminated weren't civilians. They were military combatants who chose to prey on peaceful traders. The strongholds we've destroyed were centers of organized criminal activity that your own forces have been unable to address for decades. She turned slowly, meeting the gaze of delegates from across the spectrum of known life. If our methods seem extreme, it's because we're solving problems that moderate approaches have failed to address. If our survival rates seem impossible, it's because we've had more practice at surviving impossible situations than any other species in the galaxy. The chamber remained silent for long minutes as the council processed what they had heard. Finally, Counselor Veltar spoke again, his mechanical voice carrying new undertones that Sarah couldn't quite identify. Admiral Chun, this council hereby withdraws all charges against humanity and your military forces. Furthermore, we formally request that human forces expand their peacekeeping operations to include all territories where piracy and slavery persist. Sarah nodded acknowledgement. Thank you, counselors. However, I should mention that expanding our operations will require changes to existing military cooperation treaties. Human forces operate most effectively when we're given complete tactical freedom to adapt to evolving situations. Meaning, ask Counselor THYSS. Sarah's smile returned, and this time several delegates recognized it for what it was, the expression of a predator that had just been given permission to hunt. Meaning that if you want us to solve the galaxy's problems, you need to let us solve them the human way. No predetermined strategies, no acceptable loss calculations, no rules about what constitutes proportional response. She paused, looking around the chamber one more time. Because once humans commit to solving a problem, we don't stop until the problem no longer exists. Even if we have to break every rule in the book, including the ones about what's supposed to be possible. The vote to grant humanity expanded military authority passed by a margin of 847-0. Not because the delegates weren't concerned about unleashing human forces across the galaxy, but because they had finally understood what Sarah had been trying to tell them from the beginning. Humans weren't dangerous because they were stronger or smarter or more advanced than other species. They were dangerous because they had evolved to treat the impossible as merely improbable, and the improbable as just another problem to be solved. The age of galactic peace was about to begin, whether the galaxy was ready for it or not. 2 years after the Galactic Council granted humanity expanded military authority, Admiral Sarachin stood in the observation deck of the UEF Indomitable, watching the surrender of the last known slave cartel in the galaxy. The scene before her would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. 57 enemy vessels, representing the combined fleets of the Crimson Chain Syndicate, had powered down their weapons and activated their distress beacons without firing a single shot. The most feared criminal organization in known space was surrendering to a human fleet 1/3 their size. Admiral, reported Captain Torres, her former subordinate who now commanded his own battlecruiser. The syndicate leadership is requesting permission to discuss terms. Sarah didn't turn from the viewport. Beyond the transparent aluminum, she could see the enemy flagship, its hull scarred from decades of raids against peaceful colonies. Aboard that ship were beings who had built an empire on the suffering of others, who had enslaved entire populations, and treated sentient life as a commodity to be bought and sold. Tell them, she said quietly, that there are no terms. They surrender unconditionally and submit to trial by their victims, or we solve this problem the way we solve the piracy issue. Torres paused for a moment, his hand hovering over the communication controls. Ma'am, they're claiming they have over 10,000 slaves aboard their vessels. They're threatening to execute the prisoners if we don't negotiate. For the first time, Sarah turned away from the viewport, and Torres instinctively stepped back. He had served with her for 5 years, had watched her face impossible odds with calm determination, but he had never seen the expression she wore now. Captain, she said in a voice that could have frozen plasma, patch me through to the syndicate flagship. The main display activated, showing the bridge of the enemy vessel. The figure that appeared was a Zephyrian, his scales bearing the ritual scarification that marked him as a clan leader among his people. Behind him, Torres could see other species, all armed and radiating the casual violence that came from lives spent in the pursuit of power over others. I am Admiral Sarah Chun of the United Earth Fleet, she began, her voice carrying across the communication channel with deadly calm. You have 30 seconds to release all prisoners and prepare for boarding. Any harm that comes to a single hostage will result in the complete annihilation of your fleet. The Zephyrian leader laughed, a sound like breaking glass that echoed through the communication system. Admiral, you humans are famous for your survival skills, but you're clearly not good at mathematics. We have 57 ships, Tier 19. We have 10,000 prisoners that will execute if you approach. And we have enough firepower to— 29 seconds, Sarah interrupted. The alien scales shifted color, indicating confusion. What? You had 30 seconds to begin releasing prisoners. You've wasted one of them talking. 28 seconds. On the screen, the Zephyrian turned to consult with his subordinates. Torres could hear heated discussion in several languages, the kind of rapid planning that came from beings who had suddenly realized they might have miscalculated. Admiral, the enemy leader said, facing the camera again, perhaps we should discuss. 15 seconds. The change in Sarah's voice sent chills down Torres' spine. It wasn't anger or frustration. It was the sound of someone who had already decided what was going to happen and was simply counting down to its inevitable occurrence. Wait, we need to negotiate. You can't simply attack while we hold hostages. 5 seconds. This is insane. No military force would risk civilian casualties on this scale. Time's up. Sarah nodded to her communications officer. Transmit the following message on all frequencies. This is Admiral Chun to all vessels in the area. The Crimson Chain Syndicate has declared their intention to murder prisoners rather than submit to justice. Any being who wishes to survive the next 10 minutes should abandon ship immediately. The enemy leader's scales had shifted to deep red, indicating extreme agitation. Admiral, you're bluffing. No human commander would authorize an attack that could kill thousands of innocent prisoners. Sarah smiled, and Torres recognized the expression that had become legendary throughout the galaxy. It was the smile that pirate captains saw in their nightmares, the smile that had preceded the destruction of every criminal organization foolish enough to test human resolve. You're making the same mistake that everyone makes when they first encounter humans, she said conversationally. You're assuming that we think like you do. She activated her tactical display, showing the disposition of both fleets in three-dimensional detail. You see hostages that you can use as leverage. But I see prisoners who are being tortured and abused by beings who deserve nothing but death. You think you're protecting yourselves with human shields. But you're actually giving me additional motivation to end this quickly. The Zephyrian's confidence was beginning to crack. You can't save those prisoners by killing them yourself. I can save them from years of continued slavery, rape, and degradation by ensuring that their suffering ends today, one way or another. And I can save millions of future victims by demonstrating that threatening innocence doesn't give you leverage over humans. It just makes us more determined to see you destroyed. Sarah's expression shifted, becoming something that Torres would later describe in his reports as the face of inevitable death. You want to know the difference between humans and every other species you've dealt with? Other species try to minimize casualties. We try to minimize suffering. And sometimes the quickest way to minimize suffering is to ensure that everyone involved dies quickly rather than allowing the suffering to continue indefinitely. Across the tactical display, red indicators began appearing as human ships powered up weapons systems that most of the galaxy considered war crimes when used against populated areas. Gravitic disruptors that could tear apart molecular bonds. Quantum cascade torpedoes that would eliminate matter on the subatomic level. Weapons designed not just to kill, but to ensure that death came too quickly for the victims to experience pain. Admiral, the Zephyrian said, his voice cracking with desperation, surely we can reach an accommodation. Launch escape pods, Sarah said simply. All of them. Every prisoner, every slave, every hostage you're holding. Launch them now, and I'll give you 60 seconds to surrender before I demonstrate why the galaxy has learned to be afraid of humans. For a moment, the communication channel carried only the sound of desperate conversation in the background. Then, slowly, the enemy leader nodded to someone off-screen. Escape pods launching, he said quietly. All prisoners are being evacuated. Sarah watched her tactical display as thousands of small craft began streaming from the Syndicate ships. Each pod contained beings who had thought they would die in slavery, now heading towards safety aboard human rescue vessels that had been standing by for exactly this contingency. Wise choice, she said. Now, all Syndicate vessels will power down their weapons and engines. You will submit to boarding and arrest. And you will thank whatever deities you believe in that you made the smart decision before I had to demonstrate why every criminal organization in the galaxy has learned to be more afraid of humans than they are of death itself. The surrender was complete within minutes. 57 vessels containing the leadership of the galaxy's largest slave cartel, brought to heel by 19 human ships, and the reputation that humanity had built through 2 years of absolute refusal to accept any outcome other than total victory. As the last enemy vessel powered down its weapons, Dr. Colthan's voice came through the communication system from his position aboard the medical frigate Hippocrates. "Admiral," the xenobiologist said, "I've been monitoring the medical status of the recovered prisoners. The psychological trauma is extensive, but they're responding well to treatment. Many of them are asking to speak with the human commander who freed them." Sarah nodded, though the doctor couldn't see her. "Transfer the most critical cases to the specialist trauma units on Earth. Our psychiatrists have experience dealing with recovery from extreme situations." Admiral Dr. Cal then continued, "I've been studying human military operations for 2 years now, and I still don't understand how you consistently achieve the impossible. Today, you forced the surrender of a superior force without firing a shot, while simultaneously rescuing 10,000 prisoners. The mathematical probabilities suggest that what you accomplished today shouldn't have been possible." Sarah turned back to the viewport, watching human medical ships tending to the rescued prisoners. Each ship flew the flag of Earth alongside the banner of the Galactic Council, a symbol that had become synonymous with the end of hopelessness. "Doctor," she said softly, "you're still thinking about this wrong. You're trying to calculate the probability of success based on conventional parameters. But humans don't operate within conventional parameters." She gestured toward the tactical display, where the surrendered enemy fleet hung dead in space, their weapons cold, and their crews waiting for transport to trial. Those Syndicate leaders thought they understood the rules of engagement. Superior numbers, hostages as leverage, threats of civilian casualties. In their experience, those factors should have guaranteed their ability to negotiate favorable terms. "So what changed?" Dr. Cal then asked. Sarah's reflection smiled back at her from the viewport. And even after all this time, it was the expression that had become the most feared sight in the galaxy's criminal underworld. "They encountered humans," she said simply. "We don't calculate acceptable losses because we don't accept losses. We don't negotiate with terrorists because we don't believe in leaving problems unsolved. And we don't worry about impossible odds because we've spent our entire evolutionary history proving that the impossible is just another word for something that hasn't been done yet." She paused, looking out at the starfield where human ships moved with practiced efficiency, collecting prisoners and preparing for the long journey home. Every criminal organization in the galaxy has learned the same lesson today that the pirates learned 2 years ago. When humans commit to solving a problem, the problem gets solved. Not managed, not contained, not negotiated with. Solved. Captain Torres approached with a datapad containing the final casualty reports. "Admiral, final count. 0 human casualties, 0 prisoner casualties, complete surrender of enemy forces, and recovery of 10,847 former slaves." Sarah nodded, accepting the report with the calm professionalism that had become her trademark. But inside, she felt the quiet satisfaction that came from another impossible problem solved, another group of innocent beings saved from suffering, another demonstration that the galaxy's criminals had chosen the wrong species to underestimate. "Set course for Nexus Prime," she ordered. "The Council will want a full report, and I suspect they'll have new problems that need the human approach." As the Indomitable and her escort fleet turned toward home, their wake carried a message that would spread throughout the galaxy within days. The age of fear was over for the innocent, and just beginning for those who preyed upon them, because humanity had finally stopped pretending to be fragile, and the universe was still learning what that meant. In the end, the most important entry in the Galactic Medical Database would prove to be page 3, section 12, subsection 4. Human beings do not die when it is inconvenient for them to do so. Human beings do not surrender when surrender would leave problems unsolved. And human beings do not stop fighting until they have won completely, regardless of the cost to themselves or the apparent impossibility of their victory. The galaxy had spent centuries wondering how such fragile creatures had ever left their homeworld. Now they understood. Humans hadn't left Earth despite their fragility. They had left Earth because their fragility had taught them that the only real weakness was giving up, and humans simply didn't know how to do that. The age of human expansion into the galaxy had officially begun, and the universe would never be the same.